what I try to do in the book is I take this idea of pacification, which was originally used by the Romans, but then was reinvigorated with the birth of the modern state and capitalism. And it was reinvigorated by major thinkers, the ruling elites, state officials, and so on, military officials, police officials, in order to describe a certain process of domination. Yeah. And so what I try and do there is appropriate the concept from those sources and use it in a more critical way. In other words, I'm trying to appropriate that idea of pacification for critical theory. In other words, I'm trying to use the idea of pacification to capture something about the modern world and the way the state operates in relation to the people, and the way that it operates in relation to capital and how it polices the people and manages capitalism. And it does so through what I want to make people think of as a process of pacification.
Let's start with the state. Let's start with the state and how the state kind of goes about pacification. It goes about its social war. Um, could you touch a little bit more about the difference between how the state is perceived naturally as a neutral kind of force, which is there to kind of help people and kind of like be how he is looked at in the political sphere, and how it kind of shows up in your idea of pacification. How does the state differ in our kind of normal conception of it, and how it kind of shows up in your book?
Uh, yeah, so you're using a few words there that are problematic. Um, you're talking about the normal conception of the state and how the state is perceived naturally, and those are not straightforward, right? Um, in the sense that there is a position that says the state is a neutral arbiter between forces in society, and it tries to act as a referee equally between those various forces. Um, and that idea of the state is the dominant one, because it's the one that's imposed on us by, well, politicians, but also the media tend to reinforce that, right? It is what some people might describe as the ruling ideology, right? The dominant ideology about what the state is, and it tells us that the state is a neutral force, right? And it also tells us that the state is a natural entity. Okay. The problem is that is an ideological position, right? And it's an ideological position that completely uh, misrepresents the nature of the state, the origin of the state, the operations of the state, its main functions, right? So, in a sense, my argument is against that idea that that the state is neutral and that there is a natural way of thinking about the state, right? So my argument is, which I'm not by no means the first person to say this. It has this position has a long history. The state, as we understand it, emerges with modernity, all right, which is a way of saying that it emerges alongside and with and in support of capitalism. Yeah. So these things come together. It takes a long time to develop, right? We're talking about centuries of development, but nonetheless, these things come together, and they come together because capitalism needs the state, right? It needs the state because it needs the state to police capitalism, and in particular to police oppositional forces or potentially oppositional forces within capitalism. But also, it needs the state to create the fundamental force that is at the heart of capitalism, namely the working class, right? Capitalism needs a working class. It needs a laboring class. It needs people to go out to work so that capital can profit. Yeah. The question is, how does that happen? And it happens through a whole gamut of forces which combine in our understanding of the state. Yeah, some of those forces might be, you know, police forces on the street with truncheons or batons or shields or horses or vans or dogs, but some of those forces take the form of, for example, welfare mechanisms. You know, welfare mechanisms that are designed to, for example, get people into work. Right? That's the fundamental heart that politicians see. The problem with welfare is, well, the trouble is if you give people welfare, they don't go out to work, right? We need the buggers to go to work, right? Well, that's the issue, yeah. So how does capitalism survive? It survives because it needs a working class to be initially produced for it, which the state did historically, um, and it needs the working class to be constantly reproduced so that it continues capitalism continues its project of profit and profiteering from the work of the mass, the people, the working
Mm,
class.
mm.
So,
It's the
in that sense, you know, that's an argument about the state that has a long history, but it's an argument about the state that says, look, the state is not a neutral entity, right? And the state is not a natural entity, right? If it was natural, it would have always existed. Whereas it's an essential feature of a particular historical period, namely capitalism, if you like, bourgeois society, if you like, or modernity, if you like.
then is the idea of pacification something new, or is it a marriage of capitalism and state that creates pacification?
Well, but it's not so much a marriage of capitalism and the state. It's the way I'm using the term is that I'm trying to get the reader to understand what the how do we comprehend, how do we conceptualize the process whereby the state reproduces capitalism, right? And that takes various forms at various moments, but we can understand them as a whole, or if you like, as a unity, through this idea of pacification, through this idea that the people must be pacified. Now, that again, it has different connotations depending on what you want to do with the word, right? So at the heart of this idea of pacification is the pax, right? Is peace. Yeah. Okay. So of course we're all supposed to go, yeah, great, because we all want peace, right? Who doesn't want peace? What are we against? We're against peace. Well, that sounds a bit odd, right? But then you realize that that word peace itself is again a deeply ideological category, right? Because let's just take, for example, the idea that, well, we can think about the state in general, and the state claims that, you know, without it there would be civil war, and therefore with it we have a condition of peace, right? And then of course we have major forces such as the professional police that we are constantly told are there to keep the peace, right? We're keeping the peace, right? Okay. So there is this idea of peace, and we're told that the state exists to provide it for us, to stop civil war breaking out, and that the police in particular is there to keep the peace. All right. Those same institutions, those same key institutions and forces are quite remarkably fond of declaring one war after another, right? Not, you know, the British state, right? We're going to war with France, we're going to war with Germany, we're going to war with Iraq, or we're going to war with another country, which is what we're meant to understand by war, right? But we're declaring one war after another. The war on crime, the war on vagrancy, the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on shirkers, the war on strikers, the war on the enemy within, and the war on, and on and on and on it goes. Yeah. So it's quite amazing when you think about it that we're told we live in a peaceful society, apart from a few belligerents who make it, you know, who want conflict. And yet the same people that tell us this are constantly declaring one war after another within that same society. It also declares one war after another in foreign lands, as millions of indigenous peoples across the world have understood for centuries, right? Um, so so pacification in one sense points to the idea of peace, but as soon as we start unraveling this idea of peace, what do we encounter? We encounter peace as war, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what do we do with that? Well, we have to try and make sense of it, and that requires making sense of what this process of pacification is. It's a kind of imposition of a certain idea of peace, which is operating through a whole range of processes which are constituting one war after another.
Mm.
Now, and once we start thinking about those wars, we then have to start thinking about what what forces are engaged in those wars, right? Obviously, in one sense, the professional police are at the heart of many of them, but these are also wars that other people are constantly being either, well, sometimes encouraged to engage in and other times required to engage in, right? I'm a professor, right? I am obliged to undergo training in prevent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because there's a war on terror, right?
Mm.
So I'm supposed to be trained to spot people who I think might become radicalized and therefore become terrorists. You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so these are wars that, they implicate, in a sense, they implicate all of us, right? And that this is a problem, right? Because it means that we then begin to see these wars as somehow necessary and fundamental.
Mm. Mm. I think that's so interesting too, because like you mentioned the idea of like basically the social war and the war on these kind of abstract ideas and the war on just the things that the society, the government deems as going up against, so kind of bringing insecurity or bringing a thing against peace. Talk to me more about the idea of insecurity, because I think you mentioned a very good point about you know creating essentially creating capitalist subjects, and the way they do that is by having peace, or the idea of peace, war through peace, or peace through war, on its own subject. So how does the government create insecurity in people? What are some of the ways that they kind of enforce this social war?
Sure. Okay, so I mean, this raises a question not just of insecurity, but in a sense of security, right? Which is again interesting, that we can move to that from the idea of peace, because again it's one of those words that again we're supposed to all go, yeah, well, of course we all want security, right? In the same way that we all want peace, right? And then we're supposed to absolutely not challenge any of these ideas. Um, and so at the heart of the pacification book is an argument that I've been making for some time in different books and articles, and in a security abolition manifesto that I wrote with some colleagues and comrades, friends, um, which is an argument, not only about security, but it's an argument against security, right? And security and therefore insecurity are interesting terms, and we can think about them in terms of the contemporary universe, right? We can address the fact that we all at some level feel insecure about all sorts of things, right? We could probably fill up our time together here by simply taking it in turns to list one insecurity after another, and I'll start with whatever it is, my pension, and you'll start with your job, and then we can move on to relationships, and then we can move on to the apocalypse, and then we can move on to the next virus, and then we can move on to police, and before you know it, right, we can fill up a lot of time just by going, yeah, and another thing I'm insecure about, another thing I'm insecure about. And of course, you know, some of these some of these insecurity, well, it's I mean, it's quite clear that many of these insecurities are what should we call them? Artificial, right?
Absolutely.
They're artificial in the sense that as soon as we start thinking about them, we realize how uh, manufactured they are. Right? They're artificial in the sense of artifices. Yeah.
Hmm.
Because we know, right, that we're encouraged to buy all sorts of things based on one insecurity after another. So it's, you're nodding, right? And I can, as soon as you say this, we all know this, right? It's like, okay, what do I need now? I need a new insurance policy to insure myself against this, that, or the other, because I'm insecure about whether X will happen or Y will happen or Z will happen. So I have to have an insurance policy. But then also, what else do I need to have? I need to have this commodity. What
Hmm.
is it? What is it? Do I really need a camera in my doorbell? Yes, you do. Why? Because for the extra security. Well, do you see what I mean? Yeah. This last 12 months, a couple of the major deodorant manufacturers launched uh, lower body deodorants. Right now, it's never occurred to me that I should be worried about my testicles smelling. Right, because generally speaking, you get up, you clean, and then
Yeah.
you think you might have an intimate moment. You make sure that
Yes.
right.
Yes.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
suddenly, I can now buy deodorant that is specifically designed so that my balls don't smell, right? Well, obviously I'm not worried. I'm not. This is not one of my insecurities, by the
Hmm.
way. But you can see what's happening there, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
A company goes, do you know what? We need to make some more money. Let's encourage men. Well, I was going to say men, but actually, there's the equivalent
Mm-hmm.
for women, right? Let's encourage people to start worrying about their genitals smelling, right? Now, we can laugh, right, about this, but clearly it works, right? Because some people are buying this stuff, right?
Mm.
And some of those people may have been people who had previously been feeling a little bit insecure about the smell of their genitals. But some of them will be thinking, oh shit, I didn't realize I should do this, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely. And
now
that
I'm,
creates a, yeah.
yeah, what we can call it a worry, we can call it anxiety, we can call it an insecurity that is going to be addressed by this next product, this next commodity, which is making some companies a lot of money, right?
What
So
role?
we
What
can
role
think,
do you think the state plays in that? Because I completely agree with you, and it does seem like it's a capitalist kind of movement. But do you think the state facilitates that? And if so, how do you think they do that?
well, the state isn't, you know, it's not forcing people to buy such products, right? And it's in one sense, it's not even encouraging them, yeah. But what we do live in is a condition in which insecurities can be played on
Mm.
in ways that make companies a lot of money, right? Now, that tells us something about the fundamental irrationality of our world,
Mhm.
right? It tells us that there is something fundamentally wrong about our world, right? This is interesting given that, you know, we are told that this is the best of all possible worlds. This is the most rational of all possible worlds. And the reason it's rational is because we have the state there to help us maintain ourselves, be, independent, good citizen subjects. Yeah. It's not, it's, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that, that someone in a position of power might go, don't buy this. This is shit. You're just wasting your money. Right. But they don't, do they?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. Especially if the benefit from it in some ways. And I think that's kind of I think you're completely right. There's a sense feeling there is something like wrong with our world and the way it's structured. And I think it's being felt right now even more in my generation, which is why I'm so interested in this
Yeah,
topic, right?
yeah,
Because we're seeing the state, the idea of the state, what it's supposed to be, like, we're talking about, that's something that it's an ideology that's kind of pushed on us. This is what the
yeah,
state's supposed to be, and we're seeing the reality of it, and it's
yeah,
not matching up, and we're going, wait, what can we trust?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And like you say, there are important generational issues here. There are also, of course, important class issues and race issues and gender issues, right? So we can talk about insecurities in the most abstract sense, but we also have to recognize that different insecurities hit different people in all sorts of different ways,
Mhm.
depending on those social characteristics. Absolutely. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the generational one is huge, right? If you think about the insecurities that are generated by social media, by people being on social media, right? They're quite phenomenal. And I only know them as a spectator because I'm not on social media because well, firstly, I'm not great at self-promotion, but the other thing is, you know, there is a lot of evidence now that social media is at the heart of what people are calling a mental health crisis. And if there is a mental health crisis, probably somewhere in there is what we can come back to as insecurities, right? You know, and anxieties, worries, but it's given that our topic is insecurity, security, that is at the heart of generational mental health crisis, and social media is core to that. And what is the state doing about that? Nothing, right? Indeed, what are the companies that own those social media forums doing about it? Nothing. They know it, right? They produce their own reports showing that they are the problem, or at least fundamental to the problem. Nothing. Right. So we have a world in which the state and capital are overseeing a huge generational mental health crisis about which neither state nor capital seem willing to do anything.
Mhm. Let's creep up on that question because I think
Right?
on the
So I just want to come back, right? But all of this, see, there's a problem, right? Because in a sense, all of this leads some people to say, so what we really need is more security, right? What we really need is more security measures, better security, right? More human security, right? And that's where I don't go, because the problem is that then lends itself to what I call the security industry, right? Yeah, it just lends itself to either security measures passed by the state when those insecurities are political, or yet more commodities produced by capital when those securities are the insecurities are supposedly more whatever social or based on the individual lifestyles and the like, right? And actually, I think that's not what's needed. What's needed is something else. That's more challenging. We don't have to go there, but that's my point. Is my point. My point is have to have to have an argument about the centrality of insecurity to our world is not to then make an argument that what we therefore need is more security or better security. It, that's where some people go, and that's where I don't go.
I would like to actually offer up an alternative to that security kind of like spiral. What do you think we need instead of more security? What are some of the ways that to combat insecurity as you would think about it?
Okay, well, my answer won't satisfy you, but I'll give you one. Right? Um, what we need is different ways of imagining politics. And what we need is different ways of imagining our being with others. And those ways are not easy to imagine right now because we're so entrenched in this system that's become internalized to us, right? That we think, to go back to the words you used that I picked up, we think that this is a natural condition, right? And so we end up using this language that I think is, in a sense, problematic, right? The second problem, or let me go. No, let me go to a different point and then make the second problem the third problem. Right? We can imagine politics differently, right? So one of the interesting things that a lot of people have been developing now is new ideas and thinking about care, right? About care for others. I like the idea of solidarity, right? What we need is not security, it's solidarity. And that's what we see coming out in emergency situations where people are faced with emergency conditions, right? Floods, earthquakes, viruses, whatever, right? Actually, what people reach out for is each other, yeah? Because the security forces are always well behind. And what they generally do is come in and put some armed men on the street because what they want to do is to stop people looting, right? Yeah, they're still fighting a war on crime, even when people are trying to clear out their flooded homes and offices and shops and the like, right? What emerges when you look at emergency situations is solidarity, right? People reach out to help each other. They express their needs, they take help from others, and they help others, right? And this is is an almost universal truth as far as I can see, right? And then what happens is the state comes a day or three later and puts some armed men, they usually are armed men, on the streets, right, in order to impose some kind uh, of a state dictated order on the situation,
Mm.
right? So I can go, look, yeah, let's think about, let's say, solidarity or care. The problem, this was what I was going to say is the second problem, but actually I've now made it the third problem, right? The problem is the state and capital are incredibly good at taking any and every radical idea and turning it against its origins. Yeah. Um, and that's what you see, right? So of course, the state itself likes to think of itself as caring, right? Taken into the care of the state. But by God, most people don't want to be taken into the care of the state, do they, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you know, that's one of the security measures that's often imposed on people engaged going through again another mental health crisis, right? And last thing you want to be do is to what last thing you want to have done to you is to be taken into the care of the state through that security measure known as being sectioned, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So this is a problem, right? Because the state and capital have historically shown their genius at taking any concept and appropriating it for the state and capital.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's such a, I think you mentioned it, you're right. It's such an entrenched idea that you don't really you see it unless you really take a look at it. You analyze the ways in which we live our lives and how, like you mentioned, we've become, like the human spirit shows up in times of difficulties, and that's because it's still there and it's still very prevalent. But the state and capital de kind of declutters us so much that we don't understand that until it becomes that kind of level. But I want to try to approach that question with capitalism because essentially what we're talking about here is how capitalism has become so entrenched in our daily lives that the state is now there to kind of propagate that idea. And we've kind of seen it where any other ideas which we can, talk about aren't really pushed in our minds. So
Mm.
let's just talk about the idea of capitalism and the state and pacification in the state, that kind of interchange between that. How is it that that became so entrenched, do you think? How is it that that over time became such a powerful idea in people's minds? And how has that led to more pacified people and, to kind of go back into the idea for me?
No, well, that's a question that asks about a sort of historical transformation that takes centuries, right? And it takes centuries because what had to happen was a number of related things. The first, probably most important one, is a very material one, which is that um, the mass of the people, the overwhelming body of the people had to learn that the only means of subsistence could come through the wage, right? In other words, how that how does a working class get created as a working class? Yep. And to create a working class, what that means is you have to create a class of people who are going out to work for a wage. Yeah. Okay. So how do you do that? Well, you stop them gaining any form of subsistence outside the wage, right? So what might that mean? Well, it might mean that you enclose the common lands, which is what happened historically, right? There are lands in common where people can go and pick fruit and pick wood, graze animals. Yeah. If you enclose them and make them private property, then you can't go there and catch a rabbit and pick some wood and pick some fruit. And yeah. So you need to find some other way of getting a rabbit and fruit and wood, etc. Yeah. Which means buying them. And how are you going to buy them? Well, you're only going to be able to buy them if you earn money by selling your labor for a wage. Okay, so one way is by enclosing the common lands. A second way is by introducing new laws that made historical practices that were once assumed to be perfectly right and normal and natural illegal, right? So catching a rabbit, picking some wood, picking some fruit, right? If you turn those into crimes, yeah, then you end up with a large number of people not doing them, but a large number of people become criminalized for engaging in activities that were once considered perfectly normal and legal, right? And morally right. Yeah. You can use more modern examples if you like, right? What exactly is the problem with selling single cigarettes, right? What's the problem? Well, the problem is it's against the law. Well, why is it against the law? Yeah, it's against the law because if you're selling single cigarettes, then you've got a source of income that is not based on selling your labor. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but there have been cases in the States where people have been stopped for selling single cigarettes and have ended up dead. Right? Okay. So what do? You find ways of making sure that the overwhelming bulk of the population doesn't have any means of subsistence other than the wage. And at that point, they're going to go out to work. Yeah. Okay. So part of the process is a very, very material one um, that involves creating workers, right? But also that's ideological. You have to get the people to think that it is natural that they go out to work. Not just go out to work, but it is their responsibility to earn a wage. And it is their responsibility as an individual, not as a collective. And it is perfectly natural that their employers seem to end up with a lot more money than they do. Right. And it's perfectly natural that however hard they work, they never seem to have enough money to stop work. Right. Not just stop work. For example, I'm going to work from Monday to Wednesday, and then I'm going to have a 4-day weekend, right? And not just stop work. Maybe I don't know. I've worked for 6 months of the year, and I'm just going to stop for the next 6 months, right? But also just not stop, not to not be able to stop work when they hit whatever it is, 60, 63, 65, 67. Yeah, you've got to get people to believe that that's perfectly normal and natural.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. I think and I see it.
Right? In other words, you have to get people to believe that capitalism is the normal way of things. It is a natural way of life. That there is no alternative, to use Thatcher's
Mm.
phrase, right?
Mm.
That this is it. Yeah. And of course, that then comes with a whole series of other mechanisms which, get people to accept what they're facing. The idea that, oh, well, look, if you work hard enough, you'll do well, right? Yeah. Try harder, try more. Yes, you can. You really will. Yeah, you can become whatever it is you want to be, rich, wealthy. Yeah, you definitely really, really can, right? Yeah. But you have to work at it and you have to accept that it's your responsibility.
And they sort of
And of
back with
course,
a carrot in front of you so you can keep chasing the carrot.
yeah,
You never
right.
actually will, yeah.
Yeah, a carrot, but also it's a very atomizing ideology, right? Because it makes us feel that we are solely responsible for our own, well, not just well-being, but advance, right? But it also means that we're not responsible for other people's well-being, right? In other words, it's not my responsibility to care for you. It's not your responsibility to care for me, right? That's very isolating. It's very atomizing, right? But worse, you and I might be in competition, right? And this is the capitalist dream, right? It's healthy competition, not just between capitalist units, but between you and I as human beings. Because if you and I see ourselves as competitors, then the last thing we're going to do is help each other and care for each other and act in solidarity. Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely.
So to go back and we can, I'm doing that in terms of the capitalist ideology, but we can also go back to the previous conversation a few minutes ago, which is that this is one way of making us feel not just as though we're competing with each other rather than acting in solidarity. It kind of suggests that you might be a threat to my security. Yeah.
Mhm. Which is going
Right.
against the idea of solidarity, like the
Yeah,
essence of
exactly.
solidarity, you know.
Exactly. Right. Because what it's doing is it's so atomizing us that we become isolated from each other and see each other as threats, security threats, right? Not just competitors in the economic market. And therefore, we no longer see each other as, well, like you say, what's the opposite of enemy? Friends, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's thank you for that. Actually, that's really well put and really well explained because I think you are right. We've gone to the stage where we know we really see each other as friends. That neighborly vibe that we had maybe as a society that was just entrenched in how we kind of live our daily lives has been eroded by this kind of new way of kind of relating to each other, which is through commerce. Then capitalism. People always say capitalism is a problem, but it's very hard to to understand how we've gone to this sense. So thank you for giving us that kind of explanation. One of the other ways that I see it too, especially amongst my generation, which is mainly my focus, is how to get people from my generation to understand these concepts and maybe find a way through them, is how debt is utilized in a, a capitalist society. So can
Mm.
you talk to me about that? What role does debt play in the pacification of people?
Sure, sure. Well, again, we could, if we didn't fill up all of our time together listing our insecurities, right? We could probably fill up a lot of time listing our debts. We
Yeah.
if we're all very, very insecure, we're all also all very, very in debt, right? Up to
Yeah.
our necks in it. And again, to go back to a previous point in our conversation, the generational difference is huge, right? Because of student debt now, educational debt, um, your generation is facing a yet worse problem than mine, right? Okay, so we could list our debts, right? We're all up to our necks in it, right? Every single one of us, yeah. And we're also up to our necks in debt because of, again, go back to that point about the ideology of self advancement, that we have to take on debts to get ahead, right? That's basically the lesson for students going into higher education, right? You need a degree to get a good job. You need a good job to get good money. To get the degree, you have to go into debt. Right? There's very few people that can avoid that. There's very few people that can come out of university without being up to their necks in debt. Right? Okay. So we've got those examples. We've got examples of the extent of credit card debt. Right. We also know that the mortgage, which we're told we all should aspire to, is just one massive debt that can last for decades, right? And for increasing numbers of people, doesn't get paid off until after they die, right? A debt for life, until a debt until death. Yeah. Um, why do so many people have to take on a mortgage? Well, partly because the housing system is a mess, right? And there isn't decent, affordable housing for people. That the rental market is dominated by private interests, yeah, and therefore people go, well, if I'm going to pay that much in rent, I may as well try and get a mortgage. Whereas a lot of people wouldn't take out a mortgage if they had affordable rents, yeah. So all of these things are very, very closely connected. Okay, so this raises a number of interesting questions. Well, let's think about them. I mean, the first is, if you're in debt, then you're likely to just have to carry on working, right? In other words, remain a member of the working class, and therefore remain a member of that class of people that produces a profit for capital. Yeah. Once people clear off their debts, then not working becomes an easier possibility, right? Well, the fact that we're all up to our necks in debt suggests that, you know, that we're stuck with it, right? That it's, and that suggests that debt is now uh, more integral to the capitalist system than it once was, right? Especially personal debt. That it's somehow, here we go, pacifying us, right? That of instead of not working, instead of revolting, or instead of just trying to live a better life, a life driven more by satisfying needs and pleasures, you know, we're stuck. Yeah. But there's also something else that's interesting, that is about pacifying, about the role of debt as pacification, which is that, you know, in the last 20, 30 years, there's been the development of an idea that the state can use, uh, the shorthand is MORS, which is money as a weapons system, right? And this is coming from within the military side of the state, right? That money, that the military can and should use money as a weapons system. The idea itself is quite telling, right? Money, we're constantly told, is just a very, very easy way for commerce to take place, for exchange to take place, right? That's what we're told by capital about why money exists. Yeah, it just makes exchange easier. Okay, but actually, what we're now told is that money is a weapon. Well, that sounds like a very different sort of story. And what they mean when they say money is a weapon system is not that they're going to give people some money in order not to revolt, for example. What they mean is they want people to get into debt. And they want people to get into debt so that they become wage laborers. Yeah. Again, this is about the process of pacification, right? You find this idea of money as a weapon system within counterinsurgency literature, for example. Yeah. But it's also about the process of pacification that is not about dropping bombs. It's about dropping debts on people.
Mm.
Right? It's making people understand that if they want to live in this world, they need to go out and work for a wage.
Absolutely. I think there is a restricted of like your agency that we talk about here, and you mentioned counterinsurgencies. Like when even if you disagree with the system, because you're part of the system and you're kind of looped in that wage structure, you have to keep working, and you're almost like endeavor servitude where you have to keep doing it, and especially for
Yeah.
this generation who doesn't see a way out through housing, through it seems like a very long process. It's like the way
Yeah.
debt kind of affects our freedom is very interesting to talk about here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting that you very naturally use the word servitude, right? And what does the debt industry talk about? It talks about servicing the debt, right? We service the debt, right? We have to, yeah, like it is designed to put us in servitude. What are we in servitude to? Well, we're kind of, it feels like we're in servitude to our own need to satisfy our needs. And the only way we can satisfy our needs, right, our human needs, right, a human need for whatever, education, right, a human need for housing, right, these are very fundamental needs, right, but the only way we're allowed to do that is to get into an enormous amount of debt, right, which puts us at the service of the debt. Well, what does that really mean? It means it puts us at the service of the student loan company or the bank or, yeah, the financial institutions, right? Someone somewhere, or at least some organizations somewhere, is making a lot of money out of our debt, right? Because ultimately, what capitalism really wants is to turn money into money, money into more money. Yeah. And the financial side of the capitalist system is refined in order to do that, right? How do we take money and turn it into more money? The of course the world can't exist with just turning money into money, so there has to be production, right? Because we have to eat and drink and wear clothes and make bricks and everything else that we need, right? So there has to be some production somewhere, which is what industrial capitalism does. But financial capitalism goes, nah, we don't want to bother with producing anything, right? What we want to do is to take some money and turn it into more money. So what it does is it says, okay, well, we'll pay your student fees, and over the course of the next 40 years, you're going to give us a shitload more money than we gave the university for you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, my mortgage, right? We'll pay you, we'll give you this loan. We'll put you in debt, yeah. And in the process of paying off the mortgage, I don't want to even begin to think of how much money I would have given the building society by the time I end up finished paying for it, right? The figures are scary, right? But that's how financial capitalism functions now.
Yeah, is indeed a vicious cycle of insecurity, then debt to kind of address that insecurity, which gives you a little bit of security, but then also insecurity about losing that security.
Exactly. It doesn't give you security, right? That's exactly what it doesn't do, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because the truth is, if you talk to students, right, they're not going, well, I know I'm in a lot of debt, but I've got the security of knowing that I'm going to get a good graduate job, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
you know, or you take the mortgage and you go, well, I've got a house, but I don't, if I default on my payments a few times, then I'm in trouble, right? And I also might not pay it off. And what if I lose my job? If I lose my job, I lose my home. So this is the point, right? It's a fiction, right?
Mm,
So these securities are fictions. Yeah,
mm,
they're fictions that then create the, more insecurities. Right? In
mm.
theory, they satisfy an insecurity, but they don't. They just generate more or different ones.
I'm wondering if it could have been different along the journey here. So do you know of any moments in history or any other times in history when like maybe canceling debt had shifted the social power, had changed something about how we relate to work? Uh,
Yeah,
is there any alternatives to this kind of system that we're kind of stuck in, it seems like?
yeah. I mean, look, there have been times when um, debts have been cancelled for nations, but there also have been times when debts have been cancelled for people. I mean, there is a very interesting radical group called the debt collective which does work on this and has used money in order to pay off people's debts, right? Because what happens if people get into small debts, right, and then they can't pay them off, so they get fined for not paying them off, and then they get fined again. They can't pay because the debt gets bigger, and then they end up becoming criminalized and end up serving time in prison for the non-payment of what was initially an incredibly small debt. You know, um, so the debt collective have done some incredibly good both practical and theoretical work in that field. Um, and there is a campaign to talk about a debt jubilee, right? Basically, abolish all debts, right? Abolish the debt. But of course, what that really is deep down what that is a demand. A, I was going to say demand, but actually desire to abolish capitalism, right? Yeah. Um, I mean, look, abolitionist work these days is really interesting and important, right? And it's really interesting. This political moment right now um, is really quite interesting because there's a whole series of abolitionist politics that focus in different areas, right? So, police abolition, prison abolition, debt abolition that I just mentioned. There's also, border abolition, and with some colleagues I wrote this security abolition manifesto as well, right? So there's a lot of interesting work being done by abolitionists of different types, and some of whom work across different fields as well. But what's interesting about all of those things that are going to be that are need to be abolished is they're all integral to capitalism, right? They're all integral to capitalism and to the way the state manages capitalism, right? In relation, for example, to borders or prisons, or police, right? Um, so all of those abolitionist movements and demands really raise the big question of capitalism and what we do about it, and that unfortunately is a yet bigger issue.
I completely agree. I think it's I'm seeing a lot of kind of conversation amongst my generation about that question. I think we were so into the system, or we were benefit from the system of like all this kind of growth, that we just kind of just kept going. Exponential growth was the idea, and
Yeah.
production was the idea. But now we're seeing the repercussions of that in how we relate to each other and how human beings kind of lost that connection. But a question I had actually was
Mm.
that if the idea of pacification and security are so integral to the current system and are really keeping the system together, how do we, as subject of that system, challenge it?
Well, that's that's the question you should ask next week's interviewee, right? Look, but firstly, again, there's a few things. I mean, the first is no one should read any of my books for optimism, right? Um, the world is a dark place and it's getting darker. There are sparks, right, that light up the darkness occasionally, um, but it doesn't feel right now that there's um, much cause for any optimism. One can hope, right? Hope and optimism are very different things, right? You can hope for something, but you don't have to be optimistic that it's going to happen, right? I hope that that struggles intensify and that capitalism will eventually be overturned and something better comes my way, but I'm not optimistic that it's going to happen. Yeah. Um, but you know, maybe you should ask the people that you're talking to, right? The people of your generation, as you called it, right? That's where it's going to come from.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when I speak to them, they do mention that it needs to be kind of pulling back. There's this idea of like, people going up, oh, we want to do a 4-day work week, or, there's this soft quitting idea. So
Yeah.
there is a lot of like kind of like challenging the work, kind of like the continuous work culture. and
Hmm.
like thinking the work isn't that important. Like my life is way more important. And so that's an idea that's already
Yeah,
in
yeah,
people's heads.
yeah.
Um, yeah, no, just so I'm just I guess the question is just I'm asking is like, is there any like ways that not just having a kind of a different approach to it, but like any systems that could potentially replace that, we were thinking, we talk about Marx, we talk about Hobbes, then they've written lots about this idea of what we currently have today. But did they kind of suggest something a different way to kind of work?
So, okay, yeah. So Marx once said he's not interested in writing recipes for the cookshops of the future,
Mm,
right? In other words, it, it wasn't his job to write about what the future should look like, because and part of it, he was partly worried that it was going to end up making him read like one of those utopian socialists that write down precisely prescribing how the social order should be organized, what time people should have breakfast, what times they should exercise, what time they should be working in the fields and so forth, right? And he didn't want to do that, but he was also making that point because you know the future is is for the future, is for the people who make the future to work out, right? I mean, that said, he occasionally made the odd comment at a very abstract level, which um, is all quite worth thinking about occasionally. Um, at one point he was engaged in writing about one of the programs for the German Social Democratic Party, and he was critical of it, and because they kept talking about equality and exchange and so forth, and he wanted to move beyond those ideas. Um, and he was talking about a future society and lower forms of communism, and then higher form of communism. And he said there will be a higher form of communism when we can move beyond the narrow bourgeois horizon of right and can inscribe on society's banners, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Right? This is Marx describing communism, right? Obviously, he's not describing it in the sense of what time we have to get up and so forth, because right, we don't know that. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Now, if you put that principle of social organization to people, more or less everyone I've ever offered it to says, "Yeah, that sounds lovely, right? That's wonderful." There've been surveys of Americans, a deeply capitalist polity, right? There have been surveys of Americans, and when they've been given that slogan, they think it's part of their constitution, right? This is Marx describing communism, right? From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, right? We all have different abilities, we all have different needs, and the best society would be one that realized our differing abilities, that helped us realize our differing abilities, that enabled us to bring our abilities to bear on the society, right? And would satisfy our needs, depending on what they are, because people have different needs. Yeah. Okay. So he does occasionally hint at some notion of what that society would be organized like. Um, the other thing to think about here is that the transition from feudalism to capitalism takes several hundred years, right? And the transition, if there is going to be a transition from capitalism to communism, will probably take several hundred years. So when you say what will that society look like, it's like, well, we're not talking about storming the Houses of Parliament next week and putting in a new government and then reorganizing society by. But let's have a 5-year plan. By 2030, we can make Britain look like this, right? That's not if you're thinking about abolishing capitalism, that's not what that's not what you could be thinking, right? But here's the difficulty: if you met a peasant in the year 1000, right? Or if you were a peasant, no, better still, right? If you were a peasant in the year 1000, and you said, well, I really don't like this system of peasantry, right? This system of peasantry is really rubbish. What we should do is have a system, I know, I'm going to call it capitalism, right? And where all the serfs are freed off of the land, right? And we're all free to sell our labor for a wage, and we'll all be individuals responsible for our own well-being. And so, right, in other words, if you took a person in the year 1000 and they started to describe to you society in the year 2000, they would be burnt as a witch or mad or something, right? What would it, what could it possibly mean to describe a society, what a society might look like in 500 years time, or even 200, right, for that matter? You know, and that's because societies, when we're talking about big historical epochal change, right, we're talking about a society that gets reorganized through struggles, right? Through victories and defeats in those struggles, victories and defeats of political forces, but also social forces. You know,
Mm-hmm.
now Marx was, Marx with Engels when they write the manifesto of the Communist Party, they do this really weird thing, right? Which is the opening section is all about what the bourgeoisie have done. Right? They've completely transformed the world. They've done away with feudalism. They've put money at the heart of everything. They've done away with sentimental ties. They've made nations become capitalist. They've produced wonders far surpassing uh, Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. Right? They're just this. Well, look what the bourgeoisie have done, and the reason they do that is because they're trying to get their reader to think, oh, I get it. That's what can happen when a class acts as a class, right? That takes a long time. And of course, it takes a long time partly because, well, by definition, it takes a long time, but also because sometimes they're fighting against each other in various ways, right? Because they don't always fully understand themselves as a class. But that's Marx and Engels are trying to get people to understand that that is what can happen when a class starts acting historically as a class, right? And what Marx and Engels thought was that the working class could do that to transform capitalism into communism.
Mm.
So partly my, if you like, my lack of optimism lies in the fact that that doesn't appear to be happening right now, right?
Mm.
And that doesn't appear to be happening because of the very, very fragmented nature of the class, but also because of some of the things we've been talking about, right? Pacification, insecurities, debts, isolation, and so forth. Yeah. And of course, the massive security apparatus, about which we haven't said very much, but which works very well when it needs to. When it needs to club people, shoot people, bomb people, it will do so. It can do so, right?
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think you touched on a really, really important point about the way these ideas will have to develop over time. Because I do agree. I think sometimes as a society, we have like these ideas where we refine over time. And like that example of if I was a peasant in the year 1000 and you describe to me capitalism, just even finding the language would be difficult. Even imagining such a life would be difficult unless you live the reality of it. Actually, wait a minute, yes, we have all these like amazing stuff, but then we've actually lost so much in exchange. It makes me think about the role of language, you know. And I think coming back to what right at the beginning of this episode when I mentioned the natural, the normal way of the state, I think language plays such an important part in how we
Mm,
conceptualize these things.
sure.
Do you think? Well, do you have anything to say about that? About how language kind of reimagines our relations to these things, and if we maybe reimagining that words like security or order or like state, that might be a way we can build a different kind of society. Kind of building on what we just said before about how it would take a long time. What role will language play in that evolution of that?
Yeah. Well, I guess that question of language is um, picking up on maybe some of what I've been calling ideology. You
Mm,
know,
Mm.
that the the, the words we use are are important in how we understand the world. They're important in terms of how we understand others. You just have to think about the use of the word migrant right now, for example. Um, they're important in the way they shape people's thinking about what is or isn't the reality, or is or isn't the truth, or indeed is or isn't the problem. Right? I mean, we're told refugees are the problem, and the reason we're the reason so many people think refugees are a problem is because they're constantly told about the refugee problem, right? So that category, or the language that's being used constantly, persistently, every day, over and over again, becomes ingrained, and that's how people's brains start operating, right? Which is to think, oh, what is the major problem facing us right now? Well, it must be the refugee problem, because that's all that we're told about. Yeah. Um, so yeah, you're absolutely right. Language is important, and that's goes back also to the what I was saying about how can we imagine politics differently? Can we imagine politics not through the categories that are imposed on us, or we're encouraged to use, whatever that might be, security, for example, refugees, migrants, and so forth. Um, can we imagine politics differently? Can we use a different set of categories that might enable people to think differently about their being in the world? That's what something like solidarity is intended to do. That's what something like um, care is intended to do. That's what the whole, in a sense, the whole abolitionist agenda is intended to do. Right? Is intended to make encourage people to question why some of these ideas feel so natural. Right? If you ask the question, why do prisons exist? Right? That very question immediately opens up something interesting and important. Why do prisons exist? And the answer doesn't lie in, well, because there are criminals and they have to be locked up. Yes, that's what prison does, but in the process, that obscures everything else about the nature of the prison. That the nature of the prison as a form of punishment is deeply tied to the rise of capitalism and the state. Right? Prior to capitalism and the state, you wouldn't imprison someone to punish them. Right? So that begs the question, right? What is the relationship between the prison system and the class system? Well, we know that, right? Because we know full well the the class background of most of the people that are in prison, right?
Absolutely.
We know full well that the crimes of the powerful don't get don't get punished, right? They don't even get prosecuted. Most of the time, they don't get investigated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, this is important. You know, we know full well how the courts operate, right? The classic question to ask, a group of friends in a pub, right? If you were going to appear in a court of law, would you prefer to be innocent and working class, or guilty and middle class, or innocent but black, guilty but white? Right? Yeah. And as soon as you ask that question, yeah, because deep down we know how the courts operate, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because the law operates in class ways, and racial ways, and of course gendered ways as well, that we know, right? And this is how certain groups of people end up in prison far more than others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why it's important to kind of understand the role of the state, which was my initial kind of thinking about this episode. So I wanted to understand what the state was supposed to do, what it's like actually doing, how those ways affect people. Because yes, it ends with that kind of, you mentioned that how the law is implied, it kind of instilled. but it starts and it begins with far more ideas and the ideology that's kind of implicit in our mind. Final question I have for you is that since you wrote in your book, and you've looked out into kind of how the world is kind of developed, do you think the idea of pacification is getting stronger today, or do we see cracks in the system? How hopeful you see the word hope again? How hopeful are you about the future going forward?
Not very. I thought I'd have at least one short answer in this discussion.
Oh, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I mean, it's very like poignant too. Not very. But
Look,
no.
Jeffrey, I mean, it's interesting, right? We've had this conversation. It's been really interesting, ebbing and flowing in different directions. Um, uh, we haven't mentioned the climate problem, right? And this probably tells you something important about the world, right? That we've just had COP30, yeah, the 30th time that global leaders have met to bash out a solution, a way of dealing with this problem, and they keep doing it, right? Every COP, right? Every COP, it's like, yeah, we really need a solution. No, we'll come back next year. We'll come back next year. We'll come back next year, right? Right, and you're seriously talking about a crisis of humanity, or a crisis for the human race, right? That there are serious possibilities that the human race, as a species on planet Earth, will be in trouble due to the climate crisis. I mean, other species are already in trouble, right? We know that, but you are seriously talking, but they're not able to deal with it, right? Unless they can manage to change, move, evolve, whatever, right? But the human species has got itself into this situation. How has it done that? And why won't it do anything about it? And the answer to that is because the problem has been caused by capitalism. Yeah. And the state is not willing to step in and stop capitalism continuing with the problem. Right? In other words, how should we put this most categorically? The state the state system is not willing to save humanity from capitalism.
Very well said.
Right? So that capitalism would rather commit suicide
Mm-hmm.
than stop profiteering at the rate that it's profiteering.
Yeah, yeah. And then people are starting to realize that. You
Yeah,
mentioned the
people
climate.
are. Yeah,
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 yeah.
people are. Lots of people are, right? And then what happens, right? We look. We supposedly look to the state, and the state does nothing
Mm,
year after year after year.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic.
Good. I'm glad you are. I'm pleased for you because that is your privilege
Yeah, no.
as a much younger person.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say that. That's probably it's a disease of age. I think. Give
Yeah.
me a few more years and I'll
Don't worry, young man. You will soon be cured of that illness, the sickness of optimism.
exactly. But no, I think I see a lot of my generation like realizing this, and if our democracy still works in some form, then we can actually like bring people in power who have these similar ideologies or similar ideas and understanding about capitalism as we do, and make some change. But I mean, like you've mentioned, this has been going on for thousands of years. It's like it's kind of a world that keeps going. There's constant production, constant achieving, constant making of more money for the sake of making money, eroding human spirit as it does so. It's gonna be a very, very hard thing to kind of push back against. But I think your book is one of the things that made me understand that.
Right.
Made me understand how deep this goes, how prevalent it is, how the social war. I hadn't understood that concept until I read your book about social war and how the state is fighting on many different fronts against its own kind of subjects sometimes, and
Yeah.
how he has been doing that.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you for reading it and for engaging with it.
Oh, thank you for coming on this episode today and speaking with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, Jeffrey.
All right, thank you guys, and see you guys until
Thank
next
you.
time. Peace.